Before I speak of this tale, I must warn thee of the terrors which hath been writ of. Horrors of the flesh, be it mutation or gore, and soul horror follow, as does the depravity of apathy and the deprivations of the wilds on the human body. Hail and well met to the reader of this tale. This venture is titled The Pante Cavalier, and was transcribed by Ventures League scribe Enzo Barastan the Gilded, he, her. This transcript is written to the best memory and ability of the scribe. To all who read this record, be mindful of the horrors of the flesh in mutagenic, visceral, and soul forms, as well as the depravity of apathy and the deprivations of the wilds on the human body. Hearken these words and remember them for all those that were, are, and shall be. In the year 4781 AR, following the Battle of Arsinia, the humorous human Alessio Martores, him, of the Catskill venturing party stumbled over the corpses of the dead and the dying. A deep gash in his thigh kept him from moving more than a few steps before falling forward. The battle had lasted nigh an hour and a half of quick, brutal charges. The mortal crusade had broken upon the field of Arsinia. The land past the Caloris River would be lost within the coming months if a garrison was not established. But such things were of no concern now. The Catskill had lost all but Alessio, who hauled their corpses with ropes tethered around his waist. He would need a beast or a few persons to help him. The battle was lost, but the struggle had begun anew. Arrows littered the ground in rows where stacked bodies of pierced corpses lay. Dying soldiers pleaded for the mercy of the blade that would not come for many hours. The blood-soaked earth drank deep of hewn limbs and cut bodies. The flames of war flickered between the rivers of sanguine runoff. Carrion beasts and scavenging mutants dragged away bits of flesh they gnawed and tore off eagerly. Looters, too, stripped the dead of their wealth in things the army could use again. Weapons of all kinds were scattered about the trodden earth. Beasts, too, lay amongst the dead. Steeds stuck with arrows and spears or bloated from the combustive reaction of humors and air producing horrid necrotic gases. Sickly sweet death aromas lingered on the field of battle, attracting more corpse-eaters and the few immortals of war, whose ghastly presence faded as they grew tired of the stillness brought by the daemons of death. Thousands of broken bodies that once were mortal gazed at the sky for the grace of black-feathered birds, and down at the earth where their bones would be cradled. Few priests walked the desolate battle-mire, for many of their number had been slain in the melee. The undead began stirring, ghast and the unquiet slain, who yearned for vengeance against foes who too were now rent apart by blades. Over the small crest of a hill a cavalier rode. Their steed was a dark brown stallion with black streaks in its coat. Finely polished black metal fit tightly upon its strong frame, never yielding to motion, as if a cage upon its body. From its chanfron sprouted two curling markhor horns. Each stride the great horse took, it bleated like an exuberant ram yearning to rut. The cavalier upon it held their arms out wide with pride at the slaughter, back arched to let the pale meridian sun behold the fullness of the layered segmentata plates strewn with blood. In the grip of the rider was a long lance of polished birch with a horrific sight upon it. The small form of the halfling human was impaled upon the shaft through the neck, which looked towards the hand and out the anus. The soldier's head too was impaled, the stump of the neck driven as close to the arse as possible, and the spear coming out of the eye. Behold your flattered liege, O driven souls, and weep at the man whose words were as the excrement of the buttocks. Woe to you, faithful of the launderer! Before the rider was another atop a southern charger. Brass barding leaking sanguine ichor trudged forward, its bones rickety as the clacking plates. Alessio could not see the rider, but sensed they were upon the steed. Between them was a diminutive creature, an ape-like thing between mortals and their hirsute kindred. It wielded an impossibly long iron rod in one hand, bearing the standard of the Legio Inuanii and the halberd in the other. The reveling cavalier shook their lance at the obscured rider with annoyance. I have done as you said, Agrios. Now give me what I have asked for. The rider laughed in such a way that it sounded like 100 drunken chuckles. The sound unnerved Alessio so deeply he stumbled back and crawled over the dead to hide. You have fulfilled my whims, great warlord. As thanks I shall rot with the daemons of your soil, and you shall find the bounty of wine and rich crops. The hidden rider chortled. Then let it be done. The mortals shook their lance again, splattering blood before surveying the earth. The two passed one another. In the moment when the eye sees what is before it, becomes what was, the brass steed and the miniature mutant were gone from this realm. Alessio drew his hooked sword and waited as quietly as he could for the cavalier to pass. In that moment he felt his lungs tighten and his stomach fold into itself with a sickening motion. The Catskill venturing party had slain immortal, blessed warriors before, yet never had they been so bloodied and alone. Alessio felt the fear of being alone against terror again. He remembered the swiftness of the lion bat that devoured his brother, and the amalgamated horde of mutants against the cult of the Rescindants, and the speed which they slipped between his vision. A mounted soldier could not be outran, especially with the burden of corpses and a thigh wound. Only a silent prayer could be made. The horse and rider thankfully dipped between a fold and the ground away from the venturer. Now was the moment to move. Slowly, Alessio squirmed side to side like a jerking river salamander. Tight was the rope bound to his waist, pulling the bodies of his dead party. With every writhing movement forward, the rope scraped his body and rubbed the coarse fabric of his armor into his sweaty, weary flesh. Pulling his dead comrades was a weight of body and mind Alessio had never burdened himself with. The sorrow of losing a fellow human, let alone one that was loved, had become as distant as the furthest stars. But now as he hauled his friends over the still yet flabby dead, the tears within his eyes rolled hot down his cheeks. Blood and sweat mixed with his tears and off his chin. He whimpered mournfully at the absence of a crude joke or a half-hummed tune from a people never meant to be. When the dull, lifeless eyes of a soulless corpse met Alessio's, he whimpered and struck his fist to the ground like a child. Yet still he crawled slowly through the dead. Buzzing insects amassed about the dead already and crawled on Alessio's face as he painfully shuffled through the piles of corpses. From nearby, the sound of a ram and the subtle rattle of barding began cresting from a small mound. Alessio stopped and buried his face in the crimson mud. Worms wriggled about his face as they searched for the flesh to feast on, spurred by the frenzied magics of battle. The bleating drew closer, and the steed's hooves were heard crushing bone and squelching body. Distantly, the rider's voice was heard mocking and sneering at the dead. Alessio bit his tongue until the metallic taste of blood ran down his gullet to stop himself from screaming when the steel-shod hooves snapped his ankle. The rider continued on, mocking the dead. When the bleating passed down another small hill, Alessio began shuffling faster. The pain in his ankle and leg were enough to make him grimace with pain every time his legs weakly moved. Quickly, it seemed that much of the movement would have to be done by hand. Grueling inch by grueling inch, the venturer shuffled about, with the encumbering fallen dragged behind him. Whenever he turned his head over his shoulder, he heard the voices begging for mercy, asking him why he was not strong enough to hold the line or honorable enough to die with them when the halberdiers charged. Their quiet cries haunted the venturer like nagging dogs. "Ha!" cried the Cavalier, as the beast charged through the masses and impaled a dying warrior on the lance. The Cavalier sounded distant. Darkness descended. In the agonizing time it had taken the venturer to move only a few feet, darkness came like the wings of a raven. Corpse eaters tore into deceased bodies. Predators of all kinds feasted on piles, and battle began again in horrific fashion. The undead clashed with one another, and the beasts trying to devour their corpses. Immortals who feasted on the misery danced about and cast spells of many wondrous shapes. Squelching nature supped on the blood and grew within the wounds. Only the glimmer of the stars and moon illuminated Alessio's way. Once again, he brandished the hooked sword he skewered many foes with and flopped onto his back. The wound in his leg already began to fester, and maggots started crawling there, feasting on the dead and live meat. He smacked them away with a trembling hand. In the deepest catacombs of Aragem was it like. Weakly, he drank from his water bladder and waited for his first foe to appear. He might have time, he thought. There were plenty of corpses on the outskirts that scavengers could pick off. The undead would not attack unless they were attacked themselves or saw Alessio as a foe. The venturer could only enter the half-slumber all mortals entered in the wilds, the same slumber beasts entered. But with the ache in his wounds he cleaned, he would fully slumber soon. He was too weak to even drag his comrades' bodies closer, as his eyes began to grow heavier and heavier and heavier. The clash of iron, the screams of rage and pain, the cries of steeds spurred to charge, and of orders shouted from hoarse throats. Blood-slaked earth, torn up grass, green and gold turning to brown and red, the stench of excrement and urine. Rifts of the flesh letting hemoglobic magic spill, immortals of war striking with spiritual wrath, a war in the heavens and on earth, blue to red, jagged to flabby and soft, cracking bones melting into soft tissues and firm cloth. Alessio awakened with a deep, desperate gasp for air. With trained swiftness, he readied himself. Blade drawn and arm extended, open forward and between the chest and head. His eyes moved in every direction as fast as lightning bolts. Nothing but the dead and the things eating them. Amongst them he began to crawl again. Slowly he gathered his strength, then started crawling. It was a nearly endless expanse of human ends. If the stench was not enough to sicken one, then the buzzing of putrescent flies hovering near bloating bodies picked apart by glutted animals would break any. And break Alessio nearly did. Were it not for his venture's constitution and the time he slathered himself in catoblepas essence that rendered his sense of smell inert, he would have vomited. The cracks in his being came not from the body but from the mind. His sanity frayed with every disfigured face he seemed. Gases escaped from their mouths in mockery of breathing. When he felt their sallow skin upon his own, it was enough to make him quiver in disgust. When he came across the walking dead, the venturer, against his duty, laid still until they passed. He was unfit to fight, and the bound martyrs would only have hindered him. Sometimes he contemplated cutting them loose to save himself, but the notion that when he died he would have to be weighed against leaving his beloved companions behind was heavier than them combined. Somewhere in the distance there came the damned bleating. The arrogant rider still wandered the field of battle. His eyes looked at the ground with disdainful glares. "Never shall there be a miscreant or vagabond upon my grounds. Never shall the fruit be sour, or the fields fallow, nor lovers without full, pert bodies." With every word the horse bleated louder and louder until it began laughing like a beast like us. Wherever the horse stepped, the carrion beasts converged around it, sprouting twisted ram horns and taking on a human visage of a laughing man with a curling smile and a distended chin. Heinous sounds that bore into one's ears swelled like a revelry. Bird feathers clubbed into fingers holding chalices of dark red wine. Furred beasts stood on two legs and danced and contorted before falling into one another orgiastically. Then the air shimmered. All Alessio could do was turn upon his back and hold his hooked sword close. Terror flashed in his eyes as golds, reds, and browns filled the gray sky around him. Satyrs bounded from temples that manifested an abundance, full of gleeful spirits. Death gave way to life, and 1,000 feasts filled Alessio's nose. The warmth of the hearth flooded his veins. Soon the corpses the rider stepped over turned into a lustrous carpet on which Alessio was at the center path of. His rotting friends began fading away into nothingness. The host of the rider drew near, and Alessio, struck with intoxication and terror, froze. Above him was the rider now, and then the horse. About him were spirits of ecstasy, unbound by chastity or decency. The movement of the venturer's arms was slowed. He felt out of his own body, like he was gaining control over it for the first time all over again. What was he doing? He pondered. The weight caught the tip of his sword and the strain of every muscle to drag the fabric of reality before cutting it. Glamours faded into the stark reality of war. Flesh caught the dull edge of his sword. A practiced pull, and the venturer hooked, then cut through one of the steed's back legs. Its human laughs turned into equine squeals. It fell on its side, and the rider was pinned with a sickening squelch. Alessio spat out excess bile built in his organs and flailed onto his side. The Cavalier shouted in pain for help, as the steed tried to stand up, but with only 3 legs it could not. Its humanoid face melted away into a goat's beard. One stab downward into the beast punctured its guts, letting unnaturally glossy fluids pour out. As Alessio drew his blade from the monster's stomach, its rider reached for the lance, still carrying the cadaver several times, and failed to lift it. It was then with a stab and a push in the Venturer plunged his sword into the soldier's armpit, severing the arteries. The soldier sputtered out choked words, then fell silent. Alessio, standing triumphant, wounded, and bleeding, looked at Arsinia one last time, then fell. Transcriptum terminus, addendum scribus. Alessio Maratoris crawled over the battlefield for hours upon hours. The skirmishes he had with corpse eaters saw him even bloodier, and the trek back to the town of Mara di Dorado even longer. Forage and river water was his salvation. During the day he crawled like an infant over twigs and rocks in the dirt, while at night he lit fires to ward off animals he was too weak to fight. A fortnight and a third. Mara di Dorado nursed him back to health, and some persons from the Mortal Crusade aided. Each member of the Catskill venturing party, shedding their mortal coil, were buried with proper honors and reverence, even for necrotic sacks. The Catskill venturing party has since been retired and is listed in the Archivus Venturis' annals. When last seen, Alessio was riding with the Imaginae mercenary company into the dead lands of Sargent in 4787 AR. The failed mortal crusade that ended in Arsinia is documented by the Archivus History as the Dulcet Crusade. The lands conquered by the Dulcet Crusade were lost and recovered in the preceding Yellow Crest Crusade in 4859 AR, and have been in dispute ever since with the Tricolavaris of Celle and the Euronians. No further information is known about future crusades. And to all who were, are, and shall be that read this account, glory to you. Tales of Mortality is a world-building podcast set in the world of Asenscia, created and owned by Bard over 18 years and counting. It is a fantasy world of horror and madness, a planet racked by mutation and magic, where humanity survives only through itself and the spirit indomitable against horrors natural and unnatural. The Worldbuilder, writer, producer, and artist of the thumbnail is Bard. Me! Below is a transcription of lore, as well as a link to my Instagram, Bard of the Mad Realm, where I share art related to Asenscia. Thank you all for listening to Tales of Mortality. May chaos reign. Bye-bye.